The University of Amsterdam, in the spring of 1943, issued their students a simple piece of paper. It was a declaration of their loyalty to the German occupation, their vow to comply with the Nazi regime that had engulfed the Netherlands 3 years prior. For most, it was a decision to sign and continue their education, to graduate and to live. Not to sign meant expulsion, deportation, and perhaps death. Janet Johanna Schaft, known to those close to her as Jo, to those who would soon come to know her as Hanny, picked up a pen. 22 years old, an international law major with aspirations to become a human rights attorney, she had every reason to sign. Her parents were careful people, having already lost one daughter to diphtheria and showering their daughter with a loving caution that urged her to always stay safe. But Hanny had spent her university years watching something terrible unfold. She'd watched her Jewish friends, Sonia Frank and Fräulein Polak, stripped of their rights, forced to wear yellow stars, forced to disappear into a world that suddenly wanted them dead. She'd watched Nazi policies harden and her own moral outrage harden with them. Hanny refused to sign. And in that refusal, she stepped off the path of safety forever. At first, her resistance looked like the work of a clever forger. She stole identity cards, not for herself, but for Jewish families she'd never met. She found hiding addresses for refugees, moved people through the dark network of safe houses that was slowly spreading beneath occupied Holland like roots searching for water. But Hanny wanted more. The quiet work of documents and hiding places was saving lives. Yes, but she could feel the war pressing closer, demanding something she hadn't yet given.
That is when she met the Overstegen sisters.
Truus was 19, Freddie just 16, children, really, by any normal measure. But their mother had raised them with a simple, steel-spine philosophy: if you have to help somebody, you make sacrifices for yourself. When a commander from the Haarlem resistance group knocked on their door looking for recruits, their mother didn't hesitate. The girls didn't hesitate either. Freddie, who still wore braids and looked even younger than she was, agreed to learn how to shoot. The commander explained what they'd actually have to do: sabotage bridges, blow up railway lines, and assassinate Nazis. Freddie looked at Truus and said, with the candor of someone who'd never held a weapon in her life, "Well, that's something I've never done before."
But they learned.
And when Hanny joined them, the 3 young women became one of the most remarkable cells in the Dutch resistance. Hanny, with her flaming red hair, which she loved but did not dare show, with her studious air and her knowledge of German, which allowed her to walk among the enemy and overhear their plans, became the strategist. Truus was the leader, the practical one, the decision-maker. Freddie was the scout, the young one, the unassuming one, the one nobody ever suspected, pedaling away, timing the seconds until she signaled the ambush. Yes, they used guns, but they also used something far more potent. They used their own bodies. For a woman to pick up a gun in occupied Europe was unusual enough. But to use her appearance, her gender, her youth, to weaponize the very things the Nazis dismissed, that was something else entirely. Truus would put on lipstick and style her hair, walk into a bar where German soldiers drank, and let herself be noticed. Hanny, when she wasn't yet marked, did the same. They would flirt, laugh, let themselves be bought drinks by men in grey uniforms. And when the evening deepened, they'd suggest a walk in the woods.
A romantic detour. The soldiers never came back.
Hanny later explained her ritual to Truus. Before every mission, she put on makeup, lipstick, mascara, carefully arranged hair. "I'll die clean and beautiful," she said. It wasn't vanity.
It was defiance.
It was a declaration that even in the business of killing, she would not let the war strip away her dignity. She would face whatever came looking like herself. By 1944, the Germans knew they were hunting a ghost with red hair. They called her Het Meisje met het rood haar, the girl with the red hair, and her name topped their most wanted list. They didn't know her real name. They didn't know she was a law student who'd refused to sign a piece of paper. But they knew she was killing them. And they knew they couldn't stop her. Hanny kept working. On June 21, 1944, she and a resistance fighter named Jan Boonkamp tracked a Dutch police officer named Willem Raggett, a collaborator who'd grown rich betraying his own people. As Raggett mounted his bicycle to go to work, Hanny stepped out of the shadows and shot him in the back.
He fell.
Boonkamp finished the job, but took a bullet himself. Mortally wounded, he fled, only to be captured and taken to a hospital, where Nazi sympathizers pretending to be resistance workers tricked him into giving up Hanny's name and address. The Nazis arrested her parents, sent them to Voet concentration camp, waited for Hanny to surrender.
She didn't.
But the grief, over Boonkamp's death, over her parents' suffering, forced her to stop for a time. She went underground. And when she emerged, her red hair was black. The girl with the red hair had disappeared. But Hanny Schaft was still there, wearing glasses now, moving through a country that was starving for liberation, still carrying a gun in her bicycle bag, still refusing to look away. By the winter of 1944, the Netherlands had become a landscape of hunger and desperation. The German army, retreating from the Allied advance after D-Day, had dug in for a final bitter stand. The Dutch people were caught in the middle, their cities starving, their men rounded up for forced labor, their homes requisitioned by an occupation force that sensed the end was near and grew only more vicious for it. In Amsterdam and Haarlem, people burned furniture for warmth.
They ate tulip bulbs.
Children died of malnutrition in hospitals that had no medicine. But in the shadows, Hannie Schaft kept fighting. With her red hair now dyed black and glasses framing her face, she moved through the city like a ghost. The Germans still hunted the girl with the red hair, their most wanted woman, but the girl with the red hair no longer existed. Hannie had become someone else. She carried weapons in her bicycle bag. She delivered illegal newspapers that kept hope alive in a dying country. She gathered intelligence for the resistance, using her fluent German to listen in on conversations that soldiers never thought twice about having in front of a quiet young woman. On March 1, 1945, she struck again. With Truus Overstegen beside her, Hannie tracked Willem Zirkzee, a Dutch police officer who had thrown his lot in with the Nazis, a collaborator who had made himself rich by betraying his own people. Near the WWII on the Leidsvaart in Haarlem, the two women ended his life. 2 weeks later, on March 15, they targeted Co Langendijk, a hairdresser from IJmuiden who had been working for the Sicherheidsdienst, the Nazi intelligence agency. Langendijk survived that day, but he carried the memory of the young woman's face with him. Years later, in 1948, he would testify against his own girlfriend, a traitor named Nelly Willy van der Meyden. In 1949, he was sentenced to life in prison.
The ripples of Hannie's bullets spread farther than she ever knew.
The Germans were desperate. They could feel the war slipping away, but they could still kill.
And they wanted Hannie Schaft.
On March 21, 1945, just weeks before the liberation that everyone knew was coming, Hannie rode her bicycle through the streets of Haarlem. In her bag, she carried copies of De Waarheid, the illegal communist newspaper. It was a cover, a reason to be on the move. But the real cargo was secret documentation for the resistance, papers that could not fall into enemy hands.
She hit a checkpoint, a routine stop.
The kind she'd slipped through dozens of times before. This time, something went wrong. The Germans searched her bag, found the newspapers,
found the pistol hidden beneath.
Hannie Schaft was arrested. They took her to a prison in Amsterdam. For days, they interrogated her,
beat her, starved her,
placed her in solitary confinement, hoping the isolation would break her spirit. Hannie confessed to the crime of being a member of the resistance. There was no use denying the evidence the Germans had found. But she refused to tell them the names of anyone in the resistance.
Not a single name. Not Truus. Not Freddy.
Not anyone who had trusted her with their lives. But the Germans had another way of identifying the girl. They had been searching for a girl with red hair. The woman in the cell had black hair. But hair color was not something you could dye. As the days went by, the color of the woman's hair changed. The black dye faded, and the red showed through at the scalp. A former resistance colleague of Hannie's, who had also been captured and tortured by the Germans, Anna Wigenhoff, recognized the woman in the cell. She was the girl with the red hair. The girl the Hannie Schaft had been found.
There was an agreement by then.
In the final weeks of the war, the German occupiers and the Dutch resistance had reached an understanding. No more executions.
The war was almost over.
There was no point in more killing. The Germans had given their word.
They lied.
On April 17, 1945, 3 weeks before the Netherlands would be liberated, 3 weeks before the swastikas came down and the Dutch flag flew again, 2 men came for Hannie Schaft. Their names were Matthias Schmitz and Martin Kuiper. They drove her to the dunes near Bloemendal, the same dunes where hundreds of resistance fighters had been executed in secret, their bodies buried in shallow graves that would be discovered only after the war. They walked her to a clearing. Schmitz raised his pistol and fired at close range.
The bullet only grazed her.
What happened next has become legend. According to the story that would spread across the Netherlands in the years after the war, Hannie Schaft, bleeding, facing death, refusing to give her executioners the satisfaction of a clean kill, turned to them and said, "Ik schiet better."
I shoot better.
The truth, as it so often is more complicated. Post-war interrogations suggest that Kuiper, the second man, fired the killing shot. The famous last words may have been added later by a novelist, Thun de Vries, who wrote a book about Hannie in 1956 and gave her a poetic exit. But whether she spoke those exact words or not, the meaning endures. Hannie Schaft faced her death the way she had faced the war, with defiance, with courage, with an unbroken spirit that even the Nazis could not touch. She was 24 years old. 18 days later, the Netherlands was free. When the liberation finally came, when Canadian troops swept through the Netherlands in early May 1945, when the Dutch flag flew again from windows where yellow stars had once hung, the country began the long, painful work of counting its dead. In the dunes near Bloemendal, investigators dug through the sand and found the remains of 422 resistance fighters. There were 421 men
and one woman.
Hannie Schaft had been buried where she fell, in a shallow grave that the retreating Germans had hoped would never be found. But the dunes gave up their dead, and on November 27, 1945, the Netherlands gave Hannie something she never could have imagined: a state funeral. Queen Wilhelmina herself attended, along with Princess Juliana and Prince Bernhard. The Queen looked at the coffin draped in the Dutch flag and spoke words that would echo through history. Hannie Schaft was the symbol of the resistance. But symbols can be complicated. In the years after the war, Hannie became a political football. The Communist Party of the Netherlands, which had ties to the resistance council she'd fought for, claimed her as their own. They celebrated her as a martyr of the anti-fascist struggle. And in the early years of the Cold War, when the West was busy redefining its enemies, that association became a problem. In 1951, the government forbade the annual commemoration at Hannie's grave. When thousands showed up anyway, determined to honor her memory, they were met by several hundred police officers and military personnel, supported by 4 tanks. The message was clear: the girl with the red hair was still dangerous, even in death. A small group of 7 people managed to break through the blockade and reach the burial ground. They were arrested when they tolled the bell. It took decades for the politics to fade and for Hannie to belong to everyone again.
Today, schools bear her name. Streets carry her memory.
A statue stands in Canot Park in Haarlem, where she was born. And every year in November, people gather to remember not just her, but what she stood for: the refusal to look away, the willingness to fight, the courage to die clean and beautiful.
But Hannie wasn't alone.
Truus and Freddie Oversteegen survived the war and carried its weight for the rest of their lives. Truus became an artist and sculptor, channeling the trauma into something lasting. In 1996, she founded the National Hannie Schaft Foundation, dedicated to preserving the ideals that she, Hannie, and Freddie had fought for: resistance against oppression, solidarity with the persecuted, and the importance of staying human even in inhuman circumstances. Freddie, the youngest, the one with the braids who'd learned to shoot at 14, lived quietly with her memories. She married, had children, became a grandmother. For years, she felt sidelined, overshadowed by her more famous sister, erased by the Cold War politics that had made her communist past inconvenient. But late in life, she finally spoke. In interviews, she described what it was like to kill a man and then want to help him get up. She explained why they'd done it: we had to do it. It was a necessary evil. When asked how she'd dealt with the brutality she'd witnessed and inflicted, Freddie answered with the simplicity of someone who'd learned that survival means moving forward. By getting married and having babies. In 2014, the 2 sisters, Truus and Freddie, were awarded the Mobilization War Cross by Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte. It was a recognition that had been decades in coming. Truus died in 2016 at 92. Freddie followed on September 5, 2018, one day before her 93rd birthday. The men who killed Hannie faced their own reckonings. Martin Kuiper, who'd fired the final burst from his submachine gun into her body, was prosecuted for war crimes. Found guilty, he was sentenced to death and executed in 1948. Willy Lages, the SS officer who had ordered the execution, was convicted in 1949 and sentenced to death. But politics intervened again. Queen Juliana, increasingly reluctant to authorize executions, refused to sign his death warrant. Despite public outrage, Lages' sentence was commuted to life in prison. In 1966, he was released on health grounds and returned to Germany, where he died in 1971. Matthias Schmitz, the man who'd fired the first shot that only grazed her, disappeared from history. No one knows if he was ever prosecuted. And what of Sonia Frank and Fräulein Polak, the 2 Jewish students whose friendship had first awakened Hannie's outrage? Sonia was captured, deported, and murdered in Auschwitz. She was one of the 6 million. Fräulein survived. Hidden in the Schaft home at the beginning of the war, protected by Hannie's parents Piet and Oft, who risked everything to shelter 2 young Jewish women in their attic, Fräulein later found another safe address when Hannie became too marked to continue hiding her. After the war, she immigrated to the United States. In 2009, 64 years after Hannie's death, Yad Vashem recognized Piet and Oft Schaft as righteous among the nations. The hairpin in our title, the small ordinary object that became a weapon, was never just about Hannie. It's about all the women who used what they had: their youth, their beauty, their perceived innocence, their bicycles, their kitchens, their attics, their courage. They sabotaged the machinery of death not with explosives alone, but with forged documents and hidden children, with coded messages and loaded pistols concealed in handbags. Hannie Schaft didn't use a hairpin to sabotage a prison camp. But she used something smaller: a choice, a refusal to sign, a decision to fight, a commitment to die clean and beautiful, with lipstick on, facing her executioners without flinching. And in that choice, she sabotaged something far larger than any camp. She sabotaged the Nazi lie that they could crush the human spirit. She sabotaged the idea that one person cannot make a difference. She sabotaged the silence that allows evil to flourish. Her last words, whether she actually spoke them or they were given to her by a novelist seeking poetry and horror, capture something essential about who she was.
Ik schiet beter. I shoot better. She did. And 3 weeks later, the war ended.
But her bullet, the one she fired into history, is still traveling.